An ordinary man finds a mysterious plane lost in the jungle. But when he looked inside, he saw something that made his heart stop. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The morning mist lay thick and heavy over the Louisiana bayou, a pale, ghostly veil that seemed to swallow the world whole. Marcus Ellis stood on his small wooden porch, mug of black coffee in hand, watching the vapor swirl and dance just above the water's surface. The boards beneath his bare feet were damp with the night's humidity, and the air smelled of wet cypress and decaying leaves. His old dog, Zoe, had bolted out into that same mist during the storm last night, her bark fading into the distance before vanishing entirely. Now, as dawn crept sluggishly across the sky, Marcus knew he had no choice but to go after her. He set the mug down on the railing, ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, and felt that familiar ache in his knee flare with the damp. Ever since the accident on the rigs, a snapped cable that had crushed his leg and ended his days offshore, he had been slower. But out here, slowness was a virtue. The swamps didn't reward rushing. He pulled on his weathered boots, took his flashlight and an old 12-gauge shotgun from its rack, and stepped down into the murk. The wood planks of his dock groaned under his weight as he unmoored his flat-bottomed skiff. The water lapped lazily against the hull, dark and opaque as oil, hiding its secrets. Marcus knew every inch of these bayous. He had lived here most of his life, just like his father and grandfather before him. The swamp had a language all its own, the distant croak of frogs in the cattails, the faint splash of a gar surfacing, the whisper of wind through the hanging Spanish moss. He'd long since learned to distinguish between the benign sounds and the ones that signaled trouble. Today, though, even the familiar noises seemed muffled, subdued beneath the blanket of mist. The silence pressed close around him, broken only by the steady thrum of cicadas and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere deep in the cypress stands. He poled his skiff slowly along the narrow channel, his eyes scanning for any sign of Zoe. The dog was smart but headstrong, prone to chasing after nutria and raccoons until she got herself lost. Marcus called her name a few times, his deep voice echoing oddly in the fog, but there was no answer. He glanced back at his house, a modest structure perched high on stilts, its tin roof rusted to a dull red. It looked small and lonely against the endless sprawl of water and trees. He sighed, gripping the pole tighter. Life had grown quiet since he left the oil fields. There were no crowds here, no schedules to keep, only the slow rhythm of repairs, fishing, and the occasional visitor needing an outboard motor fixed. He didn't mind it. After years of clamor and danger, he preferred the solitude. Yet, lately, that solitude felt heavier somehow, settling in his bones like silt. Maybe it was just age creeping up on him. A splash startled him from his thoughts. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, but it was only a turtle slipping from a log into the water. He cursed softly under his breath and pushed onward. The mist clung thicker the deeper he went, until even the trees seemed little more than looming shadows, their gnarled roots twisting into the dark water. It was easy to imagine ghosts here, easy to picture the bayou as it must have been centuries ago, untamed, impenetrable, ruled by silence and swamp creatures. He spotted Zoe's paw prints in a patch of mud along a narrow trail and beached the skiff to follow them. The ground sucked at his boots, each step leaving behind a wet, sucking noise. The trail wound between towering cypress knees and fallen logs, leading him farther from the main channel and deeper into wilderness few bothered to traverse. He ducked under a tangle of vines, his flashlight beam cutting across the mist like a blade, and froze. Ahead, something gleamed faintly in the murk. At first, Marcus thought it was just a sheet of metal, maybe debris from a storm, some old piece of junk washed inland by a flood. But as he drew closer, pushing aside the thick undergrowth, the shape resolved into something far stranger. It was too large to be scrap. He took another step, and then another, and suddenly the trees parted around a clearing he didn't recognize. A patch of swamp water hemmed in by knobby cypress roots and mats of duckweed. There, half sunk in the muck and draped in moss like some ancient carcass, lay the skeletal remains of an airplane. Marcus stared, his breath catching in his chest. Even through the veil of mist and decades of decay, he could see it was no small bush plane. Its wings stretched out across the swamp, their tips buried in the water. The fuselage was mostly intact, streaked with rust and grime. The paint faded to a ghostly pale. A star, white and weathered, was still faintly visible on the side, the unmistakable insignia of the United States Army Air Forces from a time long before his own. He stepped closer, the mud sucking at his boots until he could see the cockpit, its glass shattered, vines curling through the frame. The tail rose at a slight angle, half swallowed by the swamp, yet still imposing in its size. Marcus had seen plenty of old wrecks in his life, cars abandoned in the woods, sunken skiffs pulled from the bayou after storms, but nothing like this. This wasn't just forgotten. This was history, lost and hidden away where no one was meant to find it. Zoe barked suddenly from somewhere off to his left, startling him so badly he nearly dropped his flashlight. He found her standing near the edge of the water, tail wagging, oblivious to the strange presence looming behind her. He called her over absently, his eyes never leaving the plane. It felt almost sacrilegious to approach, but his curiosity pulled him forward. He waded closer, the water reaching halfway up his boots, and craned his neck to look inside the open hatch near the rear. Darkness yawned back at him, thick and damp, smelling of mildew and rust. His flashlight beam swept across what remained of a metal floor, jagged with corrosion. For a moment, he imagined the roar of engines, the cramped interior filled with men in flight suits, the rush of air as bombs dropped over some faraway target. The feeling hit him like a punch to the gut. This was a relic of war, not a forgotten relic of local life, but something far larger, something that had crossed oceans before ending up here in his swamp. He had no idea how or why, but it sent a thrill down his spine all the same. He stood there for what felt like an hour, Zoe pacing impatiently at his feet, until the mist thickened again, and a cold breeze rippled across the water. Marcus finally turned away, his mind spinning. He would come back tomorrow. He had to. Whatever this thing was, it didn't belong here. Buried in mud, shrouded in silence, left to rot unseen. When he pulled his skiff back toward home, the plane's silhouette lingered in his mind, sharp and vivid against the backdrop of moss-draped trees and pale morning fog. He had no idea yet that this discovery would change everything. All he knew was that the bayou, in its own quiet, secretive way, had just whispered something extraordinary to him. Marcus barely slept that night. The image of the sunken plane stayed fixed in his mind, stark and unreal even when he closed his eyes. Every creak of the house, every distant sound of frogs and insects in the bayou seemed to echo the thought of what he had seen. He sat at his kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the small stack of tools he'd laid out, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a coil of rope, his old hunting knife, a crowbar, and a weatherproof pouch for anything worth saving. Zoe lay curled up beside his boots, blissfully unaware of the strange weight pressing down on her owner. By dawn, the mist was rolling low across the water again, pale and spectral, as Marcus pushed his skiff out into the bayou. He guided it with slow, deliberate movements, retracing yesterday's route through the narrowing channels of black water, past leaning cypress trees whose roots twisted like grasping hands. The early air was thick and cool, filled with the tang of wet vegetation and the faint musk of decay. Even the sounds felt distant, muted beneath the fog. He reached the same muddy embankment where he had found Zoe's prints, tied the skiff to a branch, and stepped out. The ground was cold and slick beneath his boots, pulling at him with every step. His breath fogged before him as he trudged along the faint trail, his flashlight beam cutting through the dim, filtered light. After a few minutes, he saw it again. That impossible shape looming ahead, half swallowed by water and moss. In daylight, it looked even more immense. The plane rested at a slight tilt, its left wing dipping deep into the swamp while its right side rose just high enough to break through the mat of duckweed and reeds. Rust streaked down its once smooth surface, and vines curled greedily across its broken frame. The insignia was still there, faded almost to nothing, the ghost of a white star against the dull olive drab of the fuselage. Marcus approached slowly, as if afraid it might vanish if he blinked. Zoe stayed close to his side this time, whining softly, her ears flattened. When he reached the base of the fuselage, he ran his hand along the cold, pitted metal. It was solid beneath his fingers, real, not a dream or some half-remembered story told in bars. He circled around toward the rear, his boots splashing in the shallow water, until he found the open hatch he had glimpsed the day before. He hesitated only a moment before climbing in. The metal floor groaned faintly under his weight, damp and uneven, slick with algae in places where water had pooled. His flashlight beam swung over rows of stripped-out seats and shattered panels, over tangled wiring dangling like dead vines from the ceiling. The smell hit him next. A deep, earthy damp mixed with rust, mildew, and something else older. A scent that clung to forgotten places sealed off from the world for decades. In the cockpit, glass shards glittered faintly in the light. The controls were rusted into place, levers frozen mid-motion, as though the pilots had simply vanished mid-flight. Marcus crouched, running his fingers over the corroded remains of the instrument panel, trying to picture it alive. Dials glowing, engines roaring, a crew shouting over the thunder of wind. It felt impossible, here in this silent grave. He moved slowly toward what must have once been the navigator's station and spotted a canvas bag wedged beneath a collapsed panel. It was stiff with age and water damage, the fabric tearing as he pulled it free. Inside, he found a scattering of objects that made his breath hitch. A small leather-bound notebook, its edges warped. A handful of rusted .50 caliber cartridges. A tarnished dog tag with a name stamped into the metal, L.T.R. Harker. He turned it over in his hand, the letters catching the light. Someone had worn this. Someone had lived and breathed in this very space. He opened the notebook carefully, its pages clinging together. The ink had bled and faded, but a few lines were still legible. Most were mundane. Bearings, coordinates, dates. But the last entry, scrawled in hurried handwriting, read, "Leaving Port Moresby, mission east of Rabaul. Weather rough, if..." The sentence ended abruptly, washed away by time. Marcus stared at it, his mind racing. Port Moresby, Rabaul. He remembered those names vaguely from history lessons about the Pacific Theater in World War II, but seeing them here, tied to something lying in his own backyard, sent a chill up his spine. Further towards the rear, he found more remnants. a cracked pair of aviator goggles, a rusted sidearm still holstered at a waist-high mount, and faded photographs stuck to the bulkhead with yellowed tape. One showed a young woman holding a baby, smiling proudly at the camera. Another captured a group of men in flight suits, standing arm in arm before a pristine version of this very plane. Its nose art, a cartoonish figure wielding a bomb, still vibrant. Marcus traced their faces with his thumb, wondering who had survived and who had not. Zoe barked suddenly, her paws skittering against the metal floor. The sound echoed harshly in the empty cabin, snapping Marcus from his thoughts. He turned sharply, his flashlight beam darting across the walls, half expecting some shape to move in the darkness. But there was only the hollow belly of the plane and the distant call of a heron outside. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had been inside plenty of derelict things in his life, barns caving in on themselves, cars rusted into the ground, but this felt different. It wasn't just the size of it, or the age. It was the presence. The weight of history here was almost tangible, as though the very air carried echoes of the men who had flown it. He spent another hour exploring every accessible corner, prying open compartments, peering into shadowed recesses. Most were empty or choked with mud and debris, but a few yielded treasures. Another set of tags, a dented flask engraved with initials, even an old map of the Pacific folded so many times it had nearly split apart. Each item added a piece to the puzzle, though it remained far from complete. When he finally stepped back outside, the swamp's air felt startlingly fresh in his lungs. Sunlight was filtering through the thinning mist now, painting the water in bands of gold and green. He stood knee-deep in the muck, staring up at the plane's hulking frame, and felt a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. He didn't know what he had stumbled onto, not fully, but he knew it mattered. This wasn't just a curiosity to poke around for an afternoon. This was something far greater, something that had been waiting decades to be found. Marcus wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced down at Zoe, who wagged her tail impatiently. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself forever. Someone out there must have been looking for this plane once. Families, maybe, still wondering what had happened. Historians who'd combed through records that ended in dead ends. The thought sat heavy in his chest as he turned back toward the trail. He didn't notice how the world had gone quiet again, how even the frogs and cicadas seemed hushed as he pushed through the trees, the plane shrinking behind him until it vanished once more into the mist. All he could think about was the name stamped on that cold piece of metal in his pocket and the faded ink in that waterlogged notebook. Lieutenant R. Harker, Port Moresby, Rabaul. He needed answers, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt the stirrings of something he hadn't known he'd missed. Purpose. Marcus couldn't shake the weight of that dog tag from his mind. It lay on the worn wood of his kitchen table, glinting faintly in the weak light that filtered through his windows, its stamped letters etched deep as if they were carved into his thoughts. L.T.R. Harker. He ran a thumb over the letters again and again, while the leather-bound notebook sat open beside it, its warped pages drawing slowly in the warm air from the old ceiling fan. The words were few, but they burned with a sense of urgency that wouldn't leave him. Leaving Port Moresby. Mission east of Rabaul. Weather rough. If the abrupt end gnawed at him like an unfinished sentence in a language he half understood. By mid-morning, Marcus knew he couldn't stay home and brood. He needed answers. He'd grown up in these swamps, fixed boats and cars for neighbors, but he'd never been a man who tangled much with the wider world. Still, this was different. This was history, real and raw, lying half buried in the mud less than an hour from his doorstep. He pocketed the tag and notebook, slung his keys onto his finger, and locked the door behind him. Zoe barked from the porch as he left, but this wasn't a trip for her. The drive into town was long and straight, flanked by endless walls of pine and oak. The radio crackled faintly, but played little more than static and half-faded country songs. Marcus's mind wandered as he drove, replaying what he had seen inside the plane. The rows of empty seats, the shattered cockpit, the faded photographs taped to the walls. Faces stared at him in his memory, young men smiling as though they had no idea their flight would be their last. The town library sat on Main Street, an old red brick building with creaking floors and windows clouded from decades of humidity. Inside, it smelled of dust, paper, and something faintly sweet like old varnish. Behind the counter sat Mr. Whitaker, a man in his 70s whose wiry frame and sharp eyes spoke of younger days spent doing harder work. Marcus had known of him for years, but rarely spoken beyond polite greetings. "Morning," Marcus said, stepping in and holding up the notebook. "I'm looking for some help with records. Old ones, war stuff." Whitaker raised a brow but didn't look surprised. He leaned forward, peering at the notebook and dog tag Marcus placed on the counter. When his gaze settled on the tag, his expression shifted slightly, curiosity deepening into something sharper. "Where'd you get this?" he asked, voice low, more serious than the casual conversation usually called for. Marcus hesitated. He wasn't ready to tell the whole story. Not yet. "Found it in the swamp," he said simply. "Near a wreck. Looks military. Figured it was worth learning about." Whitaker studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "World War II. Pacific Theater. I served in Korea, but I heard plenty from the old-timers who fought in that one. Port Moresby and Rabaul. Those were big names back then." He gestured toward the back. "Come on, the archives are this way." The two men descended into the library's lower floor, where rows of metal filing cabinets and shelves lined with old-bound newspapers filled the dim room. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a cold glow on the stacks. Whitaker pulled open a drawer and began flipping through folders labeled with neat, faded handwriting. 1942, 1943, 1944. Marcus stood over him, scanning the room's musty corners while his heart thudded with a strange mix of excitement and dread. They found the first mention buried in a local paper's clipping. B-24 missing over Pacific, crew presumed lost. The article was brief, just a few paragraphs naming the plane's unit and base of origin. It listed the crew, 11 names, Harker among them, and stated that bad weather and enemy activity near Rabaul had likely caused its disappearance. No wreckage was ever recovered. The families had been notified, condolences offered, and the war ground onward. Marcus read the words over and over, the reality settling in. These men had been ghosts longer than he'd been alive, yet their plane was sitting less than 30 miles from his house. Whitaker pulled another folder, this one containing photocopies of declassified military dispatches. "Here," he said, tapping a sheet. "Harker's unit flew out of Port Moresby in New Guinea. Heavy fighting in that area in 43 and 44. The Japanese dug in around Rabaul, and we lost a lot of planes trying to neutralize it." Marcus studied the document, noting the terse military language, the references to special operations and enemy supply lines. But even here, details were thin. Entire sections were blacked out, censored decades ago and never restored. Why hide it? Marcus asked quietly. Whitaker shrugged. Could be anything. Intelligence work, experimental gear, something gone wrong that someone higher up didn't want remembered. The Pacific was messy, son. Not every story made it home clean. Marcus spent hours in that basement, poring over what little was available. He scribbled notes, copied down dates, and stared long at the faded photographs glued into one old scrapbook. Young crews smiling in front of their bombers, all swagger and easy confidence. He traced their faces, wondering which belonged to Harker and his men. As dusk approached, he returned home, his head buzzing with questions. After feeding Zoe and fixing himself a simple supper, he sat at his kitchen table and powered up his old laptop. Its fan wheezed like a tired engine, but it connected to the internet well enough. He typed B24 Harker Port Moresby into the search bar and hit enter. What came back surprised him. There were forums, whole communities of amateur historians and aviation enthusiasts dedicated to tracking down lost wartime planes. Some posts dated back years, with threads speculating on missing aircraft in the Pacific. He registered for an account and uploaded the clearest photo he'd taken inside the wreck. The cockpit, with its rusted instruments and shattered glass. He added a brief caption, "Found in Louisiana swamp. Looks like a B-24. Dog tag inside says LT R. Harker. Any info?" Replies came within hours. Some were skeptical, accusing him of faking it, but others were electrified. Harker's plane was never recovered, one wrote. Another user posted scans of military records confirming Marcus's earlier research. Lost near Rabaul, presumed downed at sea. Yet here it was, far from the Pacific, somehow relocated and entombed in his own backwaters. Marcus sat back, staring at the screen as new messages rolled in. People wanted coordinates, photos, proof. A man claiming to be a military historian from Texas messaged him privately, offering to drive out if Marcus would show him the site. Another said he had contact with families of the missing crew and that they'd been searching for answers for 70 years. For the first time, Marcus felt the enormity of what he'd stumbled onto. This wasn't just a curiosity or a relic. It was a chapter of history that had been ripped out and forgotten, buried in the mud until he happened across it. But as he shut down the laptop and looked out his kitchen window toward the darkened swamp, a prickle ran along the back of his neck. Headlights had passed his house twice now in the last hour, slow and lingering on the empty road outside. He couldn't recall the last time anyone drove out this far at night. He checked the locks on his doors before bed and kept the dog tag on the nightstand within easy reach. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of roaring engines, men shouting over radios, and a plane plunging through clouds into endless darkness. When he woke, just before dawn, he thought he heard a vehicle idling somewhere in the distance, its sound fading only when he rose to check. Something about this didn't feel right anymore. The plane wasn't just forgotten, it was hidden. And someone, he suspected, might want it to stay that way. The sound of tires on gravel woke Marcus before dawn. It was faint at first, a slow, crunching rhythm out on the empty road that passed his house. He lay still in bed, listening, his heart thumping faster with every second of silence that followed. Zoe stirred at the foot of the bed and gave a low growl, her ears pricking. Then came the sound again, this time closer. A car door opened and shut softly, too soft for anyone making a casual visit. Marcus swung his legs out of bed and reached for the shotgun propped against the wall. He moved through the dark house quietly, his bare feet soundless on the wooden floor. The dog padded behind him as he peeked through the curtain. A black sedan sat idling by the roadside, and its headlights off. Two silhouettes were visible inside. They didn't move. Marcus stood there a long moment, his pulse hammering in his ears before the car suddenly reversed, turned smoothly, and drove away into the misty pre-dawn gloom. He didn't go back to bed after that. By sunrise, Marcus had brewed a pot of coffee and was sitting at the kitchen table, the dog tag laid in front of him beside the notebook and his notes from the library. He couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. The forum posts from last night had drawn too much attention too quickly. There had been hundreds of views in just a few hours, and several private messages from people asking specific questions, coordinates, detailed descriptions, even if he'd removed anything from the wreck. Some came from accounts that looked brand new. By mid-morning, the sense of unease grew worse. A knock came at the door. Marcus hesitated, then opened it cautiously. Two men stood outside, dressed in dark suits that looked out of place in the humid heat of the bayou. Their shoes sank slightly into the dirt of his yard, marking them instantly as outsiders. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his hair clipped short, the other leaner with sharp, pale eyes. "Mr. Ellis?" the taller one asked. His voice was even, polite, but carried the weight of authority. "We're here on behalf of the United States Military Archives. We understand you've discovered something of interest on your property." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He studied them, noting the small badges they carried on lanyards around their necks, official enough at a glance, but the text was too small to read clearly. "What kind of interest?" he asked. "We'd like to see the site," the leaner man said, his tone firmer now. "Artifacts of this nature are government property. It's important they're secured for proper historical preservation." Marcus felt his grip tighten slightly on the edge of the door. He thought of the dog tag in his pocket, the notebook, the photographs still spread out on his kitchen table. "I don't remember inviting anyone here," he said evenly. The taller man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'd appreciate your cooperation. These things can get complicated if not handled through the right channels." Something in the way he said it, too smooth, too rehearsed, set off alarms in Marcus's head. He stepped back just enough to put distance between himself and the doorway. "I'll think about it," he replied. The two men exchanged a glance. Then, without another word, they turned and walked back to their car. The engine started, and they drove away, but Marcus knew they'd be back. He didn't waste time. He grabbed his pack, stuffed the dog tag, notebook, and flask he'd taken from the wreck inside, then slung his shotgun across his back. Zoe barked once, sensing his urgency. Marcus loaded her into the skiff and pushed off into the bayou, heading deeper into the swamp than he had in years. He knew these waters like the lines on his own hands, every hidden channel and narrow passage that outsiders would never risk. As the sun climbed higher, the swamp grew oppressive and heavy with heat. Mosquitoes buzzed in dense clouds, and the air smelled of wet earth and stagnant pools. Marcus guided the boat through narrow waterways shaded by leaning cypress trees, their roots twisting into black water like gnarled claws. He anchored near an abandoned trapping shack half sunk into the mud, a relic from his grandfather's time. Here, he could wait, out of sight. From this hidden vantage, he could see the main water route back toward his house, but no one could see him unless they knew exactly where to look. Hours passed in uneasy silence. He checked his phone once and found no signal, which wasn't unusual out here. He opened the notebook again instead, studying the blurred handwriting for the 100th time. The coordinates listed on several earlier pages caught his eye. He pulled out a map from his pack, an old one that showed the Pacific Islands during the war and traced the points. They formed a rough arc toward Rabaul, exactly as Whitaker had said. The last set of numbers ended just short of the coastline, suggesting they'd been approaching land when disaster struck. So how had the plane ended up here, thousands of miles away? As he mulled it over, movement caught his eye. A small flatboat gliding quietly down the channel he'd come from. Two figures stood aboard, both dressed in dark clothes. They weren't locals. Marcus could tell by the way they handled the boat, stiff and cautious. He crouched low, holding Zoe close to keep her silent, and watched them pass. They didn't look his way, but their course would take them straight toward the trail leading to the wreck. He waited until they were gone before exhaling slowly. Whoever they weren't historians. That night, Marcus stayed in the shack, lying on an old cot that smelled of mildew, his shotgun within arm's reach. Zoe curled at his side, restless. Through the thin wooden walls, he heard the sounds of the swamp. Frogs, owls, the distant splash of something heavy entering the water. Yet, beneath it all, there was a different sound. The faint hum of an engine in the distance, far too late for any fisherman. Sleep didn't come easily. His mind replayed everything: the wreck, the notebook, the strangers at his door, the men in the boat. He was in over his head, but there was no going back. Tomorrow, he would have to return to the plane, gather everything he could, and figure out what these people were so desperate to keep hidden. Before dawn broke, Marcus was already back on the move. The swamp was darker than usual, the mist so thick he could barely see the bow of his skiff. He felt it in his bones. He was being hunted. Marcus didn't return home. Instead, he stayed hidden in the shack deep within the swamp, sleeping only in brief, restless bursts while Zoe kept watch beside him. When dawn came, it broke with a heavy, suffocating mist that clung to the water and trees like wet cloth. He poled his skiff through the channels in silence, knowing every bend and hidden inlet better than he knew the back of his own hand. The memory of the men in the flatboat from the day before sharpened his focus. They weren't locals, and their presence here had confirmed what his gut had been screaming since those suited strangers came to his door. Whatever lay inside that wreck wasn't just a relic. Someone wanted it buried. By the time Marcus reached the clearing where the wreck sat, sunlight was filtering faintly through the canopy above. The massive plane loomed like a rusted monument, its skeletal form half submerged, the tail jutting out of the water at an awkward angle, streaked with moss and grime. He stood there for a long moment, staring at it before stepping closer. He'd come prepared this time. His pack was heavier, stuffed with supplies, extra rope, tools, a tarp for carrying anything small enough to take with him. He tied Zoe to a tree nearby, whispering to her to stay quiet, then waded into the water until he reached the open hatch at the rear of the fuselage. Inside, it was darker than he remembered. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the corroded interior, the warped metal ribs of the plane, tangled wiring dangling like vines, and patches of standing water shimmering faintly as he moved. The smell was overwhelming now, wet and metallic, mixed with decades of decay. He made his way toward the cockpit, careful not to slip on the algae-slick floor. His boots splashed through shallow pools, disturbing small frogs that had taken up residence in the wreck's lower compartments. He reached the forward section and crouched near the pilot's seat. His fingers traced the pitted control panel, pausing on a cracked compass fixed in place, its needle frozen in a direction long meaningless. In the seat beside it, lodged between twisted bits of frame, he spotted something new, a metal box, wedged tightly as if it had shifted there during the crash and remained untouched ever since. With a grunt, he braced his feet and pulled. It resisted at first, then came free with a rusty screech. He set it on the floor and pried it open with his knife. Inside were papers sealed in a watertight envelope, the plastic yellowed with age but intact. He tore it carefully along the seam. A sheaf of maps spilled out marked with flight paths and annotations in a hurried hand. Among them was a folded document stamped with "Classified" in faded red ink. Marcus stared at it, his breath quickening. He couldn't make sense of all of it, but one phrase stood out, printed near the top: Operation Silver Shore. Before he could study it further, Zoe's bark rang out from outside, sharp and frantic. Marcus froze, the sound of voices following immediately after. He shoved the papers into his pack, slung it over his shoulder, and drew his flashlight beam toward the hatch. Through the narrow opening, he saw movement. 2 boats had pulled up along the edge of the clearing, their engines cut, carrying 4 men dressed in dark clothing. They carried no fishing rods or nets. One of them held a long case Marcus instantly recognized as a rifle bag. His pulse kicked into overdrive. They hadn't seen him yet, but they were spreading out, scanning the swamp with deliberate precision. Marcus killed his flashlight and slipped deeper into the wreck, crouching low near the forward bulkhead. He held his breath, straining to hear. The men's footsteps sloshed faintly through the shallows. Zoe barked again, louder this time, before Marcus silenced her with a sharp whistle. He had seconds at best. He uncoiled the rope from his pack and lashed it quickly to a support beam near the cockpit window, then eased himself out through the shattered glass and lowered into the water on the far side, hidden from view by the massive bulk of the fuselage. The cold swamp water soaked his clothes instantly, but he didn't flinch. Keeping low, he moved through the reeds, circling back toward Zoe without breaking the surface more than necessary. The men were close now. He heard one mutter, "Tracks here," his voice clipped, his accent faintly northern. Another replied, "He's here, the boat's tied up." They were searching, their boots and oars churning the quiet water. Marcus reached Zoe and untied her swiftly, pressing a hand over her muzzle to keep her quiet. He led her deeper into the trees, moving silently along a narrow path barely visible to anyone who hadn't grown up here. Behind them, the voices faded slightly, but he knew they wouldn't give up easily. He looped around through a thicket of cypress knees, using every twist and blind turn the swamp offered. Hours later, when he was sure he'd put distance between himself and the clearing, Marcus stopped to catch his breath in another abandoned shack he remembered from boyhood. He set Zoe down and rifled through his pack, pulling out the maps and documents. By lantern light, he studied them carefully. The maps traced flight paths between Port Moresby and Rabaul, but one line, a sharp detour, was circled in red. Next to it were numbers, coordinates. He grabbed his phone and punched them in, but there was no signal here. Still, he recognized the notation well enough from his research. It marked an area far out in the Pacific, deep in waters notorious for wartime wrecks. He stared at the papers, his mind racing. Whatever Operation Silvershore had been, it hadn't been a standard bombing run. The lack of any recovery, the censorship in the files Whitaker had shown him, the sudden appearance of strangers all pointed to something much larger. And now those strangers were hunting him through his own backyard. When morning came again, Marcus made his move. He'd already contacted the historian from Texas through the forum, sending a terse message from his phone when he managed to climb high enough into dry ground to catch a faint signal. Plane is real. Bring help. Discretion important. Hours later, he got a reply. On my way with team. 2 days. 2 days felt like an eternity, but Marcus spent them preparing. He booby-trapped old hunting trails with snares and tripwires to slow anyone following him, camouflaged his skiff in reeds, and relocated deeper into the swamp with Zoe, carrying his pack and the documents at all times. He slept in fits, dreams filled with the roar of aircraft engines and the shadowy figures of men he'd never met. When the team finally arrived, they came by air, a low-flying chartered helicopter that hovered above the treetops before touching down in a clearing Marcus had scouted. Out stepped the historian, a bearded man in his 50s named Dr. Henry Cole, flanked by 2 assistants with cameras and surveying gear. They shook Marcus's hand firmly, eyes bright with anticipation. He led them to the wreck, keeping to the most hidden routes he knew. Along the way, Cole peppered him with questions about the condition of the plane, the artifacts recovered, even the men Marcus had seen searching for it. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun was sinking low, painting the swamp in shades of copper and shadow. The sight of the plane silenced even Cole. They spent hours documenting everything, filming, photographing, cataloging. Cole's assistants waded through the wreck with waterproof cameras, their lights cutting through the darkened interior like search beams. Marcus helped them haul out items too delicate to leave. Control panels, the pilot's seat, even one of the engines partially submerged in silt. He guided them carefully, pointing out where the structure was weakest. As night fell, they set up camp nearby, their generator humming softly. Marcus stayed alert, his shotgun never far from reach. He knew the men he'd seen before might return. And as he sat by the campfire, studying the hulking shadow of the wreck against the moonlit swamp, he felt a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. Tomorrow they would attempt the impossible, lifting the dead giant from its grave. The next morning came with the rumble of rotor blades. The helicopter returned, this time with a sling rigged beneath it. Cole directed the operation with precise hand signals, while Marcus and the others secured thick straps around the fuselage. The swamp trembled with noise as the massive aircraft, dripping with decades of muck and water, rose slowly, groaning in protest as if waking from a long sleep. Marcus watched, heart pounding, as the plane lifted free from its watery tomb, suspended in the air like some spectral leviathan. For the first time in 80 years, sunlight touched its entire frame. Cameras rolled, voices shouted, and Marcus stood silent, the culmination of his discovery unfolding before him. But even as awe held him still, movement at the tree line caught his eye. Figures, half hidden, watching. The strangers had returned, and Marcus knew they wouldn't let this end without a fight. The roar of the helicopter still thundered through the swamp as Marcus stared toward the shadowy figures at the tree line. For a split second, it felt as if time slowed, the suspended plane looming above the water, its dripping fuselage swaying in the air like some enormous ghost. The strangers were there. He counted at least 4, maybe more, dark silhouettes shifting between the trees, too far to see clearly, but close enough for their presence to chill his blood. They were watching, motionless, their outlines stark against the pale mist curling low across the water. Marcus tightened his grip on the shotgun slung over his shoulder and glanced towards Dr. Cole, who had noticed them too. The historian's face was drawn, pale beneath his beard, but he said nothing, his attention fixed on the wreck's ascent as if to steady himself by ignoring what loomed beyond. The helicopter lifted higher, straining under the weight. Mud and water poured from the fuselage in long, streaming curtains, splashing into the swamp below. The team cheered faintly over the noise, their voices brittle and nervous, but Marcus stayed silent. He could feel it. Whatever was about to happen was far from over. He kept his eyes on the tree line even as the plane cleared the tallest trees and began to move slowly toward the waiting flatbed barge moored farther downstream, prepared for its transport out of the bayou. The strangers didn't move, not yet. It was only when the helicopter and its cargo were safely out of sight that Marcus heard the faint snap of twigs behind him. He spun, Zoe barking sharply at his side, just as two more men emerged from the underbrush. They weren't dressed in uniforms, but their posture, their clipped haircuts, and the grim precision in their movements marked them as something more than just curious wanderers. One of them carried a pistol low at his side, the other a heavy duffel bag. Marcus stepped back, raising his shotgun instinctively. "Stop right there," he called, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline flooding his veins. The man with the duffel lifted his free hand in a mock gesture of peace, his expression calm but cold. "Mr. Ellis," he said over the drone of the departing helicopter, his voice low but firm, "you need to hand over what you've taken. The documents, the artifacts, all of it." Dr. Cole stepped forward, his face tight with confusion and anger. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice straining to be heard over the fading rotors. "This is a legitimate historical recovery. You've got no claim here." The man ignored him, his eyes locked on Marcus. "This isn't a history project. What you found is classified. It was classified then, and it remains classified now. You don't understand what you've stirred up." Marcus leveled his shotgun. "I understand enough," he said flatly. "You had 70 years to come get it. You left it there for a reason, and now it's out in the open. If it mattered that much, you wouldn't have buried it in the mud and hoped no one found it." The man's jaw tightened. "This isn't a debate. You can walk away from this, Mr. Ellis, if you cooperate. Otherwise—" His words trailed off, unfinished but heavy with threat. Marcus felt Zoe press against his leg, her growl low and steady. He thought of the dog tag in his pocket, of the photographs taped inside that wreck, faces frozen in time, men who'd flown into the unknown and never come back. He thought of their families, of the decades of silence that had followed their disappearance, and of the storm of attention already brewing online. There was no undoing it now. Even if he surrendered every scrap he'd taken, the images, the news of the wreck's recovery, none of it could be erased. Dr. Cole broke the standoff first, stepping forward again. "This isn't yours to hide," he said fiercely. "People deserve to know the truth about what happened. Families deserve closure. This plane belongs in a museum, not in some classified vault." The armed man's expression flickered, but he didn't lower his weapon. "You think you're serving the truth?" he said sharply. "You're tampering with things that were locked away for good reason." Marcus could feel the tension coiling tighter, the air thick and stifling in the swamp stillness. He shifted, slightly, angling himself toward the narrow trail he'd used before. He knew the ground here. These outsiders didn't. His eyes flicked toward Cole. "Get your people moving," Marcus murmured under his breath, quiet enough that only the historian could hear. It happened fast after that. Marcus snapped his shotgun up, not firing but pumping around into the chamber with a loud, unmistakable click that echoed across the clearing. Zoe barked explosively, lunging forward, and in that split second of distraction, Marcus shoved Cole toward the trail. "Go!" he shouted. The team scrambled, hauling their equipment and cases as Marcus backed after them, his shotgun still raised. The two strangers didn't fire. They weren't here to draw blood if they could help it, but they followed, pushing forward through the muck. Marcus led Cole's group through twisting paths only he knew, weaving between submerged roots and narrow choke points where the water rose waist-deep. He could hear the men behind them, cursing as they slogged through the swamp, but his head start and knowledge of the terrain kept them ahead. By the time they reached the secondary clearing where their skiffs were moored, Marcus's muscles burned, sweat soaking through his shirt. Cole's assistants clambered aboard first, Zoe leaping nimbly in after them. Marcus shoved the boats off just as the strangers broke through the trees behind them, their shouts ringing out in frustration as the skiffs glided silently away into the mist. They didn't stop until they reached the larger river channel, where the helicopter and barge were already waiting. The sight of the massive plane secured on the flatbed made Marcus's chest tighten. Even from here, it was awe-inspiring. Its wings, bent and weathered, stretching out like the bones of some ancient leviathan, its nose art barely visible under the layers of moss and time. The barge carried it slowly toward the highway access point miles downstream, where it would be transferred for transport out of Louisiana. Cole clasped Marcus's shoulder firmly, his voice hoarse but steady. "You've done something incredible here," he said. "This isn't just a recovery, it's a piece of history reborn. No matter what they try, it's out now. The world will see it." Marcus watched in silence, his gaze fixed on the plane as it drifted farther from the swamp. He felt a strange hollowness deep in his chest, a mix of pride and loss. The wreck had become part of him in the short time he'd known it, tied to his quiet life in ways he hadn't understood until now. But as it left, bound for a future as a museum exhibit far from the shadows of the cypress trees, he felt something else too, a sense of finality. In the weeks that followed, news of the discovery exploded. Newspapers ran photographs of the swamp recovery. Television stations interviewed Cole and his team, and online forums lit up with speculation about Operation Silver Shore. Veterans and historians debated fiercely over its purpose, some calling it a lost bombing raid, others insisting it hinted at deeper, classified missions in the Pacific. Families of the crew members came forward at last, holding faded photographs and tear-streaked letters, speaking of fathers and brothers who had vanished without a trace. Marcus stayed out of the spotlight. He watched from his porch, sipping coffee while Zoe dozed at his feet as reporters trailed into town and strangers passed down his road, searching for the swamp where it all began. He told no one where it lay. It wasn't theirs to disturb anymore. Months later, Cole called him from Hawaii. "It's here," the historian said, his voice brimming with quiet reverence. "Pearl Harbor. They've restored the fuselage, mounted it in the Pacific Aviation Museum. It's breathtaking, Marcus. Families of the crew are here. They asked about you." Marcus didn't reply right away. He gazed out at the mist rolling low over the bayou, the quiet broken only by the drone of cicadas. "Tell them," he said finally, "that their boys aren't lost anymore." The call ended. That night, Marcus sat on his porch long after dark, watching the fireflies flicker over the black water. He thought of Harker and the men whose names he'd memorized, of their photographs smiling from the past. He imagined them climbing aboard that bomber one last time, not to vanish, but to finally come home. The swamp was silent again, save for the distant cry of a heron and the soft lapping of water against the pilings. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his shotgun resting idle beside him now, and let the stillness settle around him like a familiar blanket. For the first time in years, it felt like peace. He reached down and scratched Zoe behind the ears, his voice low and steady as he murmured to her, "We did right by them, girl." In the distance, dawn began to edge against the horizon, painting the mist in pale gold. Marcus watched it rise. The bayou wakened slowly around him, and he smiled faintly. The world had changed beyond him, but here, in this quiet corner of Louisiana, life moved on at its own pace. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that was exactly how it should be. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next stories. Watch the next video and explore more incredible tales from history and beyond. If you enjoyed this story, share it with your friends and let them experience it too.